De quem é a luta pela inclusão de pessoas com deficiência? De quem é a luta por um currículo de ciências antirracista? No Brasil, me parece que, de maneira geral, embora equivocada, muitas vezes nós pensamos na luta contra o racismo como uma luta dos movimentos negros. Também pensamos muitas vezes que a luta pela inclusão de pessoas com deficiência é exclusiva dos portadores de deficiência e de suas famílias. É certo que grupos e coletivos negros foram e são fundamentais não só para o reconhecimento, valorização e celebração da nossa herança indígena e africana, mas também para denunciar, conscientizar e criar mecanismos institucionais de combate a crimes e injustiças associadas ao racismo. É certo também que os movimentos sociais de pessoas com deficiência foram e são protagonistas da luta para dar visibilidade aos preconceitos sofridos na conquista de direitos sociais e políticos, de pertencimento, de participação e de cidadania dessas pessoas. Entretanto, assim como já nos diz Bell Hooks, o feminismo é para todo mundo, a luta antirracista e a luta pela inclusão também são para todo mundo. Elas são lutas por uma sociedade sem preconceitos, que não aprisiona as pessoas nem fisicamente, nem psicologicamente em espaços segregados, que não julga ou penaliza as pessoas pelo que elas são. É uma luta por uma sociedade na qual as pessoas podem problematizar o racismo estrutural, questionar seus privilégios, possam se ver, se conhecer e se transformar a partir do olhar do outro. Essa luta se trava em diversos espaços sociais, inclusive nos espaços onde se produz ciência e onde se ensina ciência. Nesses espaços, nós podemos construir e desconstruir várias ideias acerca da história, da legitimidade, das apropriações de conceitos como raça, capacidades ou gênero, que circulam na sociedade e que são mobilizados em discursos e práticas que nos desafiam a pensar os sentidos das palavras inclusão, currículo e antirracismo. A escola, como outras instituições educacionais, universidades, museus de ciência, são espaços que refletem e retratam a sociedade. Nelas, nós percebemos a abrangência e a profundidade dos problemas que atravessam a sociedade. Mas também percebemos a dimensão das possibilidades para a superação e resolução desses problemas. Ao longo dos últimos anos, eu tenho podido refletir, junto com os meus alunos e professores das escolas de educação básica com quem eu tenho trabalhado, acerca das diversas manifestações do racismo na sociedade, bem como sobre todos os privilégios que a cor da minha pele me confere no Brasil. Nesse trabalho, nós percebemos que a escola, como outras instituições educacionais, e os educadores, como agentes, não podemos nos furtar da responsabilidade do engajamento na luta antirracista, na luta pela inclusão, uma luta que se trava em diferentes planos. Ela se trava no plano da defesa das múltiplas conquistas que nós tivemos, com respeito, por exemplo, às políticas de ação afirmativa, como a Lei 12.711 de 2012, conhecida como Lei das Cotas. Mas ela também se trava no repúdio a ações recentes, como, por exemplo, o Decreto 10.502 de 2020, que institui uma política nacional de educação especial que vai no sentido oposto ao desejado aprimoramento dos marcos legais que garantem a inclusão. Essa luta também se trava no cotidiano da escola, quando o antirracismo e a inclusão passam a constituir o currículo. Nas disciplinas relacionadas às ciências da natureza, nós temos presenciado vários movimentos nesse sentido. Vários trabalhos que tratam de aspectos culturais, químicos e estéticos do alisamento de cabelos, que dão visibilidade ao trabalho de cientistas negros ao longo da história, que explicitam a complexidade e as possibilidades de diálogo entre diferentes cosmovisões, que demonstram como o convívio entre pessoas com e sem deficiência favorece o desenvolvimento intelectual e emocional de todos, e que mostram a inexistência de respaldo científico de termos como ideologia de gênero. Nesse seminário, nós vamos ter a oportunidade de dialogar sobre experiências que visam ao enfrentamento desse desafio. Eu sou Isabel Martins, eu sou professora do Instituto MUTES de Educação em Ciências e Saúde, e nessa sessão do nosso segundo seminário internacional Desigualdade na Educação, eu estou aqui com a professora Felicia M. Mensah. Ela é catedrática do Teachers College, da Universidade de Colômbia, é coeditora do Journal Research and Science Teaching, é lead editor do Cultural Studies of Science Education e tem contribuído de forma significativa para a pesquisa e para o desenvolvimento de uma educação em ciências que seja culturalmente relevante, engajada sociopoliticamente e voltada para a promoção da justiça social. Ela, que tem promovido inúmeras ações visando ao empoderamento de estudantes e professores de ciências em vários projetos, publicou vários artigos e livros sobre temas como multiculturalismo, teoria crítica da raça, formação e identidade de professores, e já orientou mais de 30 doutorados, entre eles o da nossa querida Catemari Rosa, hoje professora da Universidade Federal da Bahia. Hoje nós estamos aqui juntos nesse cyberespaço para falar sobre alguns desses desafios e convidar a todos a pensar e a dialogar sobre como enfrentá-los.
Hello, my name is Felicia M. Mensah, and I'm Professor of Science Education at Teachers College, Columbia University. Thank you for allowing me to give this presentation, and the name of it is Inclusion, Curriculum, and Anti-Racism. I first want to start with my presentation talking about inclusion. Inclusion is a philosophy based on social justice that advocates for equal access to educational opportunities for all students, regardless of difference. Inclusive education as a broad field involves students from a wide range of diverse backgrounds and abilities, learning with their peers in school settings that have adapted and changed the way they work in order to meet the needs of all students. Historically, inclusion focused on students with disabilities with the goal for them to be educated in the least restrictive environment, according to the Education for All Children Act, or Public Law 94142. Over time, the term inclusive and inclusion has changed in meaning and intent to address a broader application of educational opportunity for all students. Engaging in this contemporary or broader view of inclusive education is very appropriate for science education and engineering education to consider. Inclusive education reflects values and principles that are connected with the challenging ways in which educational systems reproduce and perpetuate social inequalities with regard to marginalized and excluded groups of students across a range of abilities, characteristics, developmental trajectories, and socioeconomic circumstances. Hence, inclusion is linked with the principles of equality and social justice in both educational and social domains. However, we have yet to meet the social justice aims for all students, especially in science education. For inclusion to meet its social justice intentions, inclusive school cultures require fundamental changes in educational thinking about children, curriculum, pedagogy, and school organization. Therefore, the onus of change does not reside with children and their families or communities to transform an educational system that has not been receptive and respectful of their cultures, identities, languages, literacies, and communities. The system itself needs to change and adapt to today's classrooms, schools, and society. Therefore, to adhere to the philosophy of inclusion and to utilize inclusive pedagogies, science education as a field will have to change, requiring institutional and structural change at multiple levels. To be inclusive, we have to identify and remove all barriers that hinder student learning. This means increasing participation for all students who are experiencing inequities in education, especially students of color. For science education at the elementary school level specifically, we need to adapt to the changing demographics that schools are experiencing. For inclusive pedagogies to benefit all students, science has to be taught within broader social-cultural, social-historical, and social-political contexts that invite multiple perspectives, knowledges, and understandings into the science classroom. This is critically important at the younger grades as foundational beginnings to build upon what students already know from personal, cultural, and community experiences with science. And elementary science and engineering education will require multi-level support for teachers and schools. The notion of empowering school policies that I talk about in my research starts at the local level in working with elementary schools, elementary teachers, and administration to implement change, and then to move forward towards higher levels such as district, state, and national-wide policies that support science education through inclusive pedagogies and curriculum. There are challenges to these approaches, but science education is uniquely situated to work towards inclusive practices aimed at educational equity for all students. In my experiences with elementary school science, students have a natural interest and curiosity with science. There is science enjoyment. They enjoy science. They question the world around them. They like taking things apart and building them back up again. They love being outside to take nature walks, make observations in their neighborhoods. Back in the classroom, there is excitement. The classroom is energized, buzzing with educational noise, laughter, and loud talking. All questions are worth investigation. Science is fun, engaging, relevant, and students want more of it. Unfortunately, instructional time in elementary classrooms on average is only 15 to 17 minutes per day, according to a recent study by Eric Banlow. With my work in elementary schools, this time is actually generous. Science is not a high priority subject due to high stakes testing, with 5 times more minutes devoted to reading language arts instruction and 3 times more for mathematics than science. In many urban school settings, science may not be taught at all during a week, perhaps maybe once or twice for about 30 to 45 minutes during the entire week. This certainly is not enough time for high engagement and enjoyment of science and engineering. At the same time, another phenomenon is at work, and I'd like to share a short story with you. For students of color during their pre-K-12 schooling, they were alienated from learning science or did not have rich science learning experiences in school. In many urban elementary classrooms, science was not taught, and many elementary school teachers were taught by teachers who did not hold science as a priority, had weak science content knowledge, and limited science professional development themselves. Their teachers demoted science learning to completing worksheets, making science uninteresting and unnecessarily challenging. When science was taught, typically started in middle and high school, and perhaps once more in college, the experiences are passed on to their students as well, with their eyes on science being more like a chore to teach, reflected in following the script, producing learning environments that are not engaging, where the science content is boring and irrelevant, and the pedagogy is predominantly lecture style, reading the text and little connections to issues of interest. For them, science unjoy was normalized. As students of color in these school settings continue their education, eventually they graduate from high school with a science education that has not prepared them for the necessary skills and knowledge base to be critical consumers of science. They are not college ready for science or science-related careers. They do not enter college as STEM or computer science majors, nor desire to become science teachers. In teacher education programs for elementary science education, teacher candidates enter their teacher education program, carrying with them a legacy of science learning neglect passed along from their teachers' teachers. Reflecting on their experiences, they note that teachers did not prepare them for science learning, and they too opted out of advanced placement mathematics and science coursework in high school. Most of them have forgotten the little science they did learn in high school, while others avoided taking any upper-level college classes in science or mathematics. They elected to take humanities and other fields, hoping to be far removed from any association with science, mathematics, or closely related fields. Without a strong science background, they are intimidated by science, just as their teachers were when they were in their science education experiences. Now they are charged with teaching increasingly diverse schools and classrooms. They do not share the cultural backgrounds and experiences of their learners. In their classroom as teachers, they are less than casually committed to teaching science to their students because their cooperating teachers do not teach science either, and the cycle continues to the next generation. Having a strong science background would have set these teachers and their students on pathways leading to science-related careers and opportunities. Instead, as the cycle continues, another generation of students suffer. They have fallen short of an opportunity to participate and are now more than ever science-connected, technologically savvy, innovatively engineered, mathematically minded, computer-focused modern world. We have lost yet another generation of potentially motivated STEM, computer science, or engineering majors and teachers. In this scenario, covering 3 to 4 generations of little to no science teaching and learning, we can surmise the current state of affairs, where the trajectory of school science learning produces and reproduces achievement gaps, or what Gloria Lasting-Billings calls an education debt. From elementary school through middle and high school, which continues into the professional level and beyond, so many teachers, once students, have not benefited from a STEM education. In times of educational turmoil and reform, such as the COVID-19 pandemic and remote learning, it is all the more important that we broaden participation in STEM and engineering education. It is equally important that the connection between teacher education and teacher professional development be strengthened. In addition to the inaccessibility of science or STEM education through the scenario that I shared, there is a racial analysis that presumes that race has contributed to, or racism has contributed to, all contemporary manifestations of group advantage and disadvantage. Race shows up and is ever present in the inequitable access to science for children in urban classrooms, poorly resourced schools and communities. Alienation, exclusion, and inequities is the science curriculum. This perpetual cycle of non-science education for students of color is a serious threat to the educational equity, access, and opportunity that is kept alive over several generations. Overshadowing this view is attention to how institutional factors perpetuate race and racism, maintain inequity for students of color, and deny them a science education. In a white-dominated society, most of us have received little or no education and information about racism and are thus unprepared to think or to talk about it critically and openly. Of course, we have our personal experiences. However, this is not enough to contend with the years of explicit and implicit bias that has contributed to our misunderstandings of self and others. We are not immune to what society has forced on us. We are not exempt from the many influences of race and racism on our thinking, teaching, and interactions with one another. Hence, we must engage in conversations about race explicitly. For teachers, these conversations about race and their views about education and the students they serve, mainly students of color, students from linguistically and economically diverse communities, have to also make critical reflection on their practice and how they engage students in learning. Discussions of race and teacher education must occur to address the deeper meanings held by teacher candidates and the influence that race and racism have on educational equity and their teaching. In previous work in science teacher education, I have used many approaches to address diversity, equity, and racism in elementary science education. These approaches reveal assumptions and biases that teachers have about diversity and teaching students of diverse cultural, ethnic, linguistic, and racial backgrounds. I challenge teachers, pre-service and in-service, to consider not only their pedagogy, but how they frame their teaching and learning of science for the students they serve. If we want teachers to understand the impact of race and racism on education and on their science teaching, then we have to engage them in critical conversations about race and racism, while supporting them in the development of language to do so, and curriculum that attends to the racial ethnic diversities of their students. Even so, on a daily basis in our classrooms, white children are taught that they are white. This comes through the curriculum that prioritizes Western ways of knowing and Eurocentric perspectives, and in classroom practices that incorporate their mainstream experiences and interactions over others. While doing this, teachers also create and maintain an educational distance where African American students and students of color are not engaged, and learning is not connected to their experiences and histories. Their identities are not part of the curriculum. Curriculum reforms have failed to override the influences of what students bring to the school as their gender, religion, race, and ethnicity are ignored. That schooling and the school process of curriculum is generally reproductive. It is active in reproducing the economic and cultural imbalances upon which society is built, namely the white dominant views of teaching, learning, and living. Furthermore, curriculum has the ability to recreate race and racial inequity because students can read their existence or non-existence in the textbooks and curriculum materials used in the classroom. Leonardo and Grubb stated, "The curriculum project becomes a racial project because the traditional white norm curriculum is not based on the experiences of African American students and students from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds. The curriculum taught in schools noticeably does not attend to the particular experiences and knowledges of students of color. Consequently, African American students and other marginalized groups feel excluded in their K-12 to college science experiences." These remarks communicate the critique of traditional white norm curriculum as not meeting the needs of African American students and students of color. There is a need to be intentional and inclusive in developing curriculum that addresses issues of race and racism in science education and engineering education. We cannot neglect a science education and engineering education for African American children and children of color. Because our students of color have suffered so much and for so long from educational inequities due to our failure to center their experiences, to invite their identities into the classroom and curriculum, to allow them to move through their learning multilinguistically, we have to be better at supporting their educational needs through the work that we do with their teachers, through the development of curriculum, and to invitations to broaden their participation in science and engineering. The opportunities to talk about issues of race and racism in science teacher education and science teacher professional development can be created by giving explicit attention to assisting all teachers in developing racial literacy. Racial literacy to talk about their teaching and practices through a racial lens. For them to produce anti-racist curriculum and pedagogies is a great task. The development of science curriculum or science lessons and unit plans is a common activity for teacher candidates and practicing teachers. Race-based curriculum and pedagogies can be supported in teacher education, but this must be sustained with ongoing professional development to challenge and reform existing curriculum to be more inclusive of race conversations and content. For anti-racist curriculum and pedagogies to work, science and STEM educators and policymakers have to reconsider frameworks that will support teachers in reflecting critically on their practices to center race. Anti-racist curriculum and pedagogies certainly involve intentional effort. We have to believe our children are more than deserving of an education and curriculum that speaks to their needs and experiences, a curriculum that highlights their culture and language, a curriculum that acknowledges their histories and contributions, and a curriculum that moves towards action and the betterment of themselves and their communities. In our beliefs, race is not peripheral to teaching and learning, but a direct and central place in the science classroom and in the curriculum. As we consider ways to engage all learners in science and engineering at the elementary level, consider formal and informal learning experiences, how students naturally interact with STEM on a daily basis. Consider the rich cultural, linguistic, and community knowledges, practices, and interests students have that have not been invited and welcomed in the STEM classroom. Instructional approaches that center identity, even historically connected identity by highlighting cultures of color that have made advances in STEM. People and knowledge that have not been recognized in the curriculum and pedagogical practices are now included and have their way in the curriculum and the classroom. Consider assessment as an opportunity for children to share what they know rather than having them meet standards that are not designed to capture their knowledge but falsely accuse them of not being smart. As mentioned before, policies that inhibit science and engineering education must change. Policies that negate the rich cultural knowledge of children of color must be stressed. 15 to 17 minutes of science in elementary classrooms is unacceptable. Thus, policies to ensure that elementary science become a priority must be established. Without deliberate action to tip the balances for elementary science education, we continue to produce inequities that have far-reaching implications for how we live, move, and have our very existence. Elementary science education is foundational to the continuing science, STEM, and engineering education that our students enjoy and deserve. As an ongoing effort of my work to work with K-12 science education, it is my desire that the constraints be removed, the curriculum and pedagogy become inclusive, and that children truly see the fun and enjoyment of learning science. Thank you.